Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. So we've got mortgage rates skyrocketing. What does this mean for the housing market and housing prices? We also have Donald Trump saying he wants to buy Greenland. It never ends with Trump, right? And he's also saying that we need to take back control of the Panama Canal. I don't know. Maybe we should. We're going to explore that right now on this video. And is the dollar doomed? We've got everyone on social media saying that the dollar is going to crash. We're going to go over the mechanics as to why that may or may not happen. Right at the end of this video, you guys got to stay tuned, buckle up. This is going to be an awesome after Christmas Rebel Capitalist live stream. Let's get into it right now. We'll do the screen share, and we are going to cruise on over to a chart of what mortgage rates are doing right now, or not necessarily right now, but I really want to focus on what they have done since the Fed started cutting rates. And this is what I'm talking about. They've been skyrocketing. I wasn't really talking about the last hour or the last day, although they have gone up significantly. I'm really talking about since the Fed started dropping rates. Why is this important? Well, let's think about it. The Fed is dropping rates because they're a little more concerned, so they say, with the labor market than they are consumer price inflation or the economy being overheated, let's say. All right, well, if you're dropping rates because you want to give a little bit of a boost to the economy, or you don't want to be as draconian, let's say, to the economy by keeping rates far too high and restricting all of that economic growth. And that's what's giving the benefit or the edge, let's say, to the labor market. Well, the only reason that would hold true is if interest rates actually went down. Well, what's happening along the curve? Interest rates are going up, not down. And if interest rates are going up as a result of inflation and growth expectations increasing, then what could happen if the Fed continues to drop more or cut more going into 2025, that could increase rates at the long end of the curve. They could go even higher. Now, to be clear, this is not my base case, as you guys know from watching my videos. But what we're doing right now is we're going through a thought experiment. And we're saying, okay, let's see what has happened since the Fed dropped rates. And let's extrapolate that forward into the future. And if this does happen, again, there are no certainties, only probabilities. But if this does happen, what does that mean for the overall economy? What does that mean for housing prices? And potentially, what does that mean for other assets? Because if we have problems in the housing market, then that could force people to sell other assets on their balance sheet to compensate for the decreased perceived purchasing power. Because again, at the end of the day, unless you sell your house, all of these gains that you have from home appreciation are just simply on paper. All right, so to be specific here, Josh, can you see this chart?
Yes.
Okay. When the Fed, or right after the Fed cut rates, are and we'll just go with the national average. I don't really know what the bank rate is. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll just use the national average as a proxy for what mortgage rates are doing. Not that this is the exact number. So back in September 22, so September 22 of 2024, September 22nd, I guess I should say, the national average right around 6.21%. Okay. Today, we are up over 6.86. So the Fed has dropped by literally 100 basis points, while at the same time, and by the way, let's keep this in focus too, because the Fed has dropped interest rates by 100 basis points in order to support the labor market, i.e., the U.S. economy, by dropping interest rates. But yet what has happened is interest rates have actually gone up. Not at the front end of the curve, of course, but at the long end of the curve. And the long end of the curve, long rates, especially the 10-year, I would argue, matter a lot more for the real economy than short-term interest rates. Although short-term interest rates impact corporations and all these things, I would say still the 10-year has more of an impact on the broad economy. Okay, so what we have to do is ask ourselves the question, why are these rates going up? Now, you guys would say, George, this is obvious. It's just because of the 10-year. Maybe. Obviously, that's part of it. But I think there's more to the story than just the 10-year interest rate. Let me show you what I'm talking about. We'll go over here and look at now this is from the Richmond Fed. And I wish we had an exact date. I think this probably ends at 2023, but we can see this spread increasing. Now, what is this? This is the spread between the 10-year Treasury and 30-year mortgage rates. 30-year mortgage rates are the darker color, dark blue or black, and the 10-year Treasury yield is the lighter blue. So you see, usually, I mean, this goes back to 1990. They are very close. I would say tied at the hip. It's very rare to see a big spread on the 30-year mortgage rate. Usually tied at the hip, except since the Fed has started to do what? You guys know. Quantitative tightening. Right here. So they're reducing the size of their balance sheet. Now, if I had to, and I don't know how they're reducing the size of their balance sheet. I assume they're not really selling stuff. They're just letting assets roll off their balance sheet. So as they mature, the Fed gets paid. They are not taking that and buying more of the exact same asset. In other words, they're not rolling it over. Okay, so if you have T-bills, let's say you have 1 month T-bills, when they mature, you've got two options. You can go ahead and take the money and just spend it, invest it, or you can just take that same money and buy another 1 month Treasury. You can just roll that over, right? So usually what the Fed does is if they want to maintain the size of their balance sheet, flatline, they're just going to roll that over. If they want to increase the size of it, obviously they're going to buy on net balance. But if they want to decrease the size of their balance sheet, they don't necessarily have to sell. Just not roll over the assets they have, the bonds that are maturing. So I'm just guessing here. I would assume that they tried to do this with mortgage-backed securities first. If I'm the Fed, that's how I'd do QT. I would do the mortgage-backed security. I would let those roll off the balance sheet first. Why? Because I would be concerned with my interference with the free market. And I would say, okay, I don't like the fact that our balance sheet is 9 trillion, but it is what it is. So I've just got to play the cards I'm dealt. And if I'm just coming in 2022 and like, George, what are you going to do? Well, the first thing I'd do is reduce the size of the balance sheet. And if I had to do that, I'd probably do it a hell of a lot faster. But if I had to do it at this pace, I would definitely start with mortgage-backed securities. Because I'd be like, am I impacting the free market in mortgages more or less than I'm impacting the free market in treasuries? And to me, that's a no-brainer. Mortgage-backed securities for sure. So what happens with mortgage-backed securities is there's two components as to what's driving rates. Mortgage-backed securities, meaning mortgages, the underlying asset. It is the 10-year, like we said, but it's also the fact that there's going to be a compression spread when, or a spread compression, excuse me, when the Fed is in there buying, because they're just buying at any price, right? So you've got the growth and inflation expectations, absolutely, but that spread is going to decrease theoretically, or the odds are the spread is going to decrease when the Fed is out there buying, because they provide this backstop, if you will. A little bit different with treasuries because there isn't really a default risk there, but we'll save that for topic of another video. The bottom line here is if they are selling mortgage-backed securities, then you would expect the spread between the two to increase because not only are we dealing with growth and inflation expectations, but we're also dealing with the risk or the increased risk of default, right? Because now all of a sudden, if it's on the Fed's balance sheet, they don't care about default. But if these mortgage-backed securities on the bank's balance sheet, well, guess what? They really care about default of the underlying mortgage, and therefore they are going to have to be paid for the additional risk, the risk premium on top of growth and inflation expectations, where you don't have that risk premium with treasuries. So that would be my first explanation as to why we are seeing this spread increase. So what this means is if the Fed continues to do QT, even if the 10-year treasury starts to go down, you could see this phenomenon. I'm not saying this is my base case, but you could see this phenomenon where mortgage rates continue to go up even though the 10-year is not going down, just because that spread's increasing. It may happen. It may happen. But I think what the overarching message is that I'm trying to communicate is just because the Fed is dropping rates doesn't mean that rates are dropping. Meaning just because they're dropping at the long end, it doesn't necessarily mean that rates at the long end are dropping as well, even if that's what the Fed wants. See, at the end of the curve, it's really all about growth and inflation expectations. And for further proof of this, let's consider the complete opposite. We're looking at the Fed selling mortgage-backed treasuries, but now let's look at the Fed buying just treasuries. And I don't want to confuse you, but I do want to highlight how a large component of rates, and by far the largest components of interest rates for treasuries, is this growth and inflation expectation. So if the Fed is out there buying, you would expect interest rates to go down, when often we see interest rates do the exact opposite of what you would expect. And the example I always use is QE 123. So if we do QE versus let's say interest rates. Here we go. Let me try to zoom in here for you guys. So most people just assume that when the Fed was buying or doing quantitative easing, that rates at the long end of the curve were going down because the Fed was buying at any price. They were creating all this additional demand. But what we can see, each green shaded area represents the 10-year treasury, or excuse me, the time that they're doing QE. The blue line represents 10-year treasury yield. So you see QE1, rates went up. And then rates went down when they stopped doing QE. QE2, rates went up. Stopped going, then went down when they stopped. Operation Twist, not much. QE3, rates go straight up. So you see what I'm saying? With the treasuries, it's really more so about just inflation and growth because you don't have that risk premium. Whereas with mortgage-backed securities, you've got this component for sure. Because to a certain extent, it's a derivative of the 10-year treasury, right? Which is all about growth inflation. So that's going to be baked into the cake when you're looking at the price of the rate for the mortgage itself. But again, the point I'm trying to highlight here is that there's an additional risk premium on the mortgage-backed securities we need to be cognizant of. That is likely one of the main reasons the mortgage rates right now are 6.8 as opposed to maybe 5%, which would be the usual spread between the 10-year treasury and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Okay, so now what does that mean for the housing market? Well, to determine what this means going into 2025, I think we have to look at what the housing market has been doing over the past couple months. I mean, this is something I really haven't paid too much attention to because there's so much going on, so much more going on in global macro. But let's do Schiller. Schiller housing prices adjusted for inflation. Interactive chart. Okay, cool. Let's look at this because it shows us what's happening in local markets. So this is all market driven, right? I mean, if we look at the US as a whole, let's start with that. Okay. It is true that prices, they've gone down slightly, but they're definitely higher than they were at this peak or one of the peaks back in 2022. So we're looking at housing in the United States in general. Bam, there you go. But it gets a little more nuanced when you get into the specific cities. I mean, as an example, my guess is Tampa is way down. Not too much, pretty much flat. Okay. Let's look at if they had Austin. I know that would be way down. Let's look at Dallas. Okay, down slightly from this peak in 2022. Let's look at Phoenix. I'm guessing that's down slightly. Oh, that's down pretty significantly. So here's our top in 2022, and there's where we are now. So Phoenix down the most so far, for sure. Seattle, I'm guessing, is down. Yep, Seattle's down. What else here? I wish we had Austin. I'm sure you guys have probably followed the news on that, but Austin, I know, is just getting shellacked. Boston, San Francisco is probably down. Yeah, way down. Denver probably down, I'm guessing. Yep, slightly. Portland, I'm guessing down. Is Portland down? It's kind of tough to see. Yeah, Portland's down slightly. Las Vegas, I'm guessing, is down. Yeah, just barely. I'd call that flat. So you see, my point here is when the real estate market overall starts to roll over, it starts with submarkets. I mean, we saw this back in 2007, 2008. I'm not saying that the housing market is going to crash to that extent, but I am saying that when these cycles roll over, it's very rarely that 100% of the markets crash in unison. Even in 09, 10, 11, the markets were, the markets that really started going down were Phoenix, Vegas, Miami, probably, all these high flying markets that led up to the crash. But then once they started going down, at a certain point, they started taking down all the other markets that didn't go up that much. I mean, Kansas City is a very linear market, but that didn't evade the effects or the impacts of the GFC in terms of housing prices. Housing prices still went down there, although it didn't start off that way. That's my point. So I'm not saying that housing prices overall are going to go down nominally in 2025, but I am saying if the cycle has started, this is generally what it looks like. And also, if we continue to see the Fed doing quantitative tightening, we will likely continue to see the spread staying very large or actually growing, depending on how much QT they're doing, with the 10-year Treasury and mortgage rates. So then the question becomes, well, what happens with the 10-year Treasury? If you're looking at it through the lens of mortgage rates and how they're impacting the housing market. Well, then what you have to do is you have to say, is your base case that the 10-year Treasury goes down or up into 2025? This is an interesting question. I could argue both. I mean, my base case is that at the end of 2025, rates will be lower on the 10-year, but I could totally see how they can go higher between now and then because that's what they do every time in the cycle. Like I've pointed this out many times, but I think it's worth repeating. If we look at, this is the 10-year Treasury. If we look at this going back to '07, you can see if we zoom in this time frame right here where the 10-year Treasury, and if you can't see this, this is March of 2008. The 10-year Treasury was about 3.3, and it went all the way up to 4.25. So almost 100 basis points from March '08 to June '08. So I hear a lot of people online talk about how the move in Treasury since the Fed started dropping rates is totally unprecedented. And this means that the Fed is losing control of the long end of the curve. And it's because all the supply coming online from the deficits and blah, 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 blah. To me, that's not a very good argument because, look, I mean, did this happen in sync with the Fed dropping rates? No, but it's still within the cycle itself. It's very common to see the 10-year Treasury go up by 70, 80, 90, 100 basis points. And keep in mind, it did this during the recession. The United States that's what this shaded part represents, the official recession. But remember that the NBER didn't declare the recession until December of '08. And they said, oh, yeah, by the way, we've been in recession since January of '08, the last year. We just didn't tell you about it. So during this time frame, there was no recession, right? So if you were living in markets in, let's just say, April 2008, there was no recession at that time because the NBER hadn't announced it yet. So you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, look at the CPI go up because of sticky inflation. And oh my gosh, the Fed is losing the long end of the curve. And oh my gosh, the Fed is dropping rates too fast and it's overcooking, it's overheating the economy. And then the other people had been saying, well, I don't know, we might be in a recession right now. And then the rebuttal would be, of course we're not in a recession. We have positive real GDP growth. Of course we're not in a recession. Unemployment is historically very low right now. Literally the exact same arguments that you'd be getting right now. So again, my point is not to say the 10-year Treasury yield is definitively, without a doubt, going to go back down. And we're going to have a big crash and recession, yada, yada. We could. That's probably my base case. But it doesn't mean that that's going to be the way it plays out. It could absolutely be different this time. But I am saying that just because we see the 10-year Treasury yield go up by 80 basis points or whatever it's gone up by since the Fed started dropping rates, it doesn't necessarily mean that's unprecedented. This is nothing we have ever seen before, and therefore we have to conclude this time is different. Okay, so I think that kind of ties the ribbon around the housing market. Let's get over into Trump buying Greenland. I don't know much about Greenland. I've never been there, but I think it offers an interesting question to libertarian and people that subscribe to the non-aggression principle, especially Panama, the Panama Canal. Let's go to this story on what exactly Trump is proposing. So here's NBC. Okay, Trump takes aim at Canada, Greenland, Panama Canal in Christmas Day posts. So if you haven't been paying attention here, President-elect Donald Trump took aim at Canada, Greenland, Panama Canal, and series of Christmas Day posts. Okay, suggests that the United States should take control of all three. Writing on Truth Social, Trump wishing everyone a Merry Christmas, including the soldiers of China who are lovingly but illegally operating the Panama Canal. You gotta love the way Trump phrases things. You can hate him, you can love him, but you cannot deny the dude's definitely entertaining. I don't know if we want an entertaining president, but he is definitely entertaining. That's for sure. So he's poking fun at Trudeau, saying that it's the 51st state, and if he wants, he can be the governor. Okay, let's get down to the nitty gritty here. Here we go. So Trump recently suggested his administration could obtain control of the Panama Canal, criticizing the fees Panama has charged to use it. The United States helped build the crucial shipping channel in the early 1900s and took control or had control until 77, when it entered into an agreement to eventually hand control over to Panama. The two countries shared operation of the canal until 99, when Panama took full control of it. So this poses a very interesting question, like I said, to libertarians. So and I'm not suggesting Trump is talking about taking this over by force, but look, if we have something that's crucial to national security that's outside of our border, does it justify taking it by force? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm asking you guys, what do you think? There's an argument for yes and an argument for no. I think ideally, if I had a magic wand to wave, I wouldn't have ceded control over to Panama. I would have said, hey, look, if you take this back to our original deal, and I'm assuming it was this way. I know JP Morgan actually financed this. James Pierpont, or was that his name? JP, I think it was James Pierpont Morgan, because he was the junior. Was it? Let me see. Let me get this right here for you guys. I know the infamous JP Morgan, not his dad, was the one that financed the Panama Canal. But let's. Oh, great. I'm getting it in Spanish. Okay, here we go. How U.S. President J.P. Morgan made Panama and turned it into a tax haven. So there's the building. Oh, yeah, and another thing that I learned is Panama actually was just created by the United States. Panama originally was Colombia, and Colombia didn't want to play ball, I think, as far as the canal. So the United States is like, yeah, okay, we'll just take that from you then. So is that, I mean, I don't know. Again, there's an argument for it. There's an argument against it. I don't know that there's a libertarian argument for it, though. Let's go on here. This goes way back. Panamanian state was originally created to function on behalf of the rich and self-seeking of this world, or rather their ascendants in America when the 20th century was barely born. Panama created by the United, and keep in mind this is Guardian, so you're going to get that left-leaning thing here. But let's just focus on the facts. Panama was created by the United States, purely selfish. Okay. I love all the editorial here. Can we just state the facts? Right on the historic hinge between imminent demise of Britain. Okay. In 1903, Theodore Roosevelt created the country after bullying Colombia into handing over what then was the province of Panama. Roosevelt acted at the behest of various banking groups, including JP Morgan, which was appointed as the country's fiscal agent, ranging and managing 10 million of aid. Yes, okay. The Canal Treaty was closely followed by Panamanian Revolution, which was led by French promoter of the canal and backed by what Bushnell calls the evident complicity of the United States, and was aided by the fact the terms of the Canal Treaty forbade Colombian troops from landing to suppress it, lest they disturb free transit of goods. Yeah, my point here is I don't know why we agreed to hand this over. Like if we owned it, I'm not saying it's great that we effectively stole land from Colombia, but assuming that that's the way it took place, I don't know why we wouldn't have said, okay, this piece of land that we are developing is owned by the United States. This is our territory within a region, and we're not going to give it back to you. We'll pay you some sort of fee. Sure, fine, a tax, a commission on the travel back and forth, but this is our territory, and we're going to manage it moving forward. I don't know why we're like, okay, we'll give you back the keys in 20 years or something like that. I mean, this would have avoided all this conflict to begin with. And I want to be clear, I'm not an expert. I'm just giving you guys my thoughts out loud here as I go through this story. So Trump is now saying, okay, we want it back. And I get it, because if, let's just say, China were to take control over the Panama Canal, that probably wouldn't be too good for the United States. They'd have us there by the short hair. That's for sure. At least temporarily, until that manufacturing of what went through the canal came back to the U.S. But boy, that's a most likely very, very long time in the making, if that ever comes to fruition. So I don't have a good answer for you, other than I wanted to bring this to your attention so you guys know what's going on, and then maybe you can think it through using your own personal framework as to what is right, what is wrong, and what is the role of the actual federal government. You know, I'm not saying there's no role for the federal government whatsoever. I don't know I'd go to that extreme, but I look at it in terms of Milton Friedman, I think, articulated it best, where he's like, look, rule of law and protect the borders, or just protect, national security, protect other countries invading us and whatnot. And, that's about it as far as the federal government. Would this qualify as protecting the United States or protecting our borders? I think there's an argument for that, but I don't know where you draw that line. Now, going over to Greenland, it's a little bit different. I think he wants this as a strategic kind of military base. And I'm also guessing, although I don't know this, that Greenland is probably rich with some sort of resource. I don't know if there's nat gas there, or oil, or some sort of rare earth minerals or something like that. But I'm assuming it's kind of a two-pronged approach there. Now, if we could get Greenland, assuming that there is some strategic use for it, at a price, and without just taking it by force, obviously from a libertarian standpoint, I would much prefer this. And same thing goes with the Panama Canal. I just don't know how on earth you could negotiate that deal, because I mean, so much of the Panamanian economy is the Panama Canal, right? Where, if I believe the Danish control the Greenland right now. It's under Denmark. And if I'm not saying that right, Danish and Dutch, I apologize, but I believe it's under the control of Denmark. In which case, how vital is Greenland to the economy of Denmark, assuming they're the ones that own it? Probably not that much. And if Trump is using this as a negotiating tactic, okay, I mean, I get it. Yeah, here we go. It's part of Denmark. I just can't remember if Denmark was the Dutch or the Danish. I always get that confused. Anyway, you guys can correct me in the chat. But my point is, there's probably a lot of things that we could offer Denmark that would be more attractive than just this massive hunk of ice that they manage, that's 3,000 miles away from them, or however far it is. So the only thing that I would kind of I would ask Trump about is I would say, look, dude, if you actually are trying to negotiate for Greenland, do you really want to put it out there that you want to buy Greenland? That's not a real good idea. Because now they know that you want it. So they're going to jack the price up a hell of a lot more than they otherwise would have, knowing how desperate you are to get it. So I probably would have gone at them with more, hey, what can we do for you? And what can we do to better your economy? Or how can we help you out? I like Denmark. What can we do to scratch your back? It was Donald Trump talking. And they say, well, you can do this, this, and this. Say, yeah, I think that sounds good. I think that sounds good. Now, what can you guys offer to kind of help us out? Oh, this, yeah, maybe, maybe. Now, what can we do to help you out even more? In fact, you guys didn't even think about this. We could do this. And pretty soon the government of Denmark, all the politicians out there who really care about one thing and one thing only, that's themselves, are like, ooh, wow, this Trump guy, he's talking our language. Boy, we didn't even think of that. We didn't even think of that benefit or this benefit. And then all of a sudden he's sinking the hook. And you're like, okay, we can make it the deal even sweeter. Got to throw in Greenland. And now all of a sudden, it's a negotiating tactic we used to use in business when you were buying a business or selling a business. You understood this tactic, and it's very common. And for those of you in private equity, you're going to know exactly what I'm referring to. And you guys probably use this all the time. Where if you're buying a business, you want the seller you want to agree to anything the seller says up front, because you want to psychologically get them in the state to where they're already spending the money. And then once you get that in that state, once you get them in that mental state to where you have sunk the hook emotionally, then you start saying, okay, well, let me see your financials. Oh, wow, you only have 2 years of financials? Yikes. Okay, usually we require 3 years of financials. And oh, what you say your financial statements aren't audited? Yikes. Okay. Usually we require audited financials. So, we offered you 5 million for your business, but I don't know, with only 2 years of financials, they're not audited. I mean, that's a lot of risk that we're assuming here. I think we'd be willing to go in at 4, not 5. And then they're, oh, yeah, okay, well, I see what you're saying. And in their mind, they've already spent the money. They've already got that hut, they're thinking about that lifestyle on I was going to say the hut. Let's say the house on the beach in Hawaii and, all these things. And they're like, okay, we'll take the 4 million. And then you're like, okay, we're good on the 4 million, but we still have another 30 days of due diligence. Let's just get those bank statements so we can go ahead and cross-reference those with your financials. Oh boy, the bank statements don't match the financials. Why is that? You see where I'm going with this. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but assuming we know everything, which we probably don't, that's probably the approach I would have taken with Denmark if my overall objective was to get control over Denmark for the United States. I wouldn't just go right into the deal with the business owner that's trying to sell, saying, "Oh my gosh, 5 million, we're happy to pay you that. In fact, we'll give you a lot more because I'm desperate to have this because I have to have it for my national security." Geez. Okay. Then as far as Canada becoming part of the United States, I don't maybe. I mean, I don't know that would be. I don't see the downside to it as far as from the standpoint of the United States. I'm sure there's something I'm not considering, but I honestly don't see the downside there. I don't know if I'd have to think that through from the standpoint of Canadians. I mean, they've probably got a lot of, pride issues and, historical thing. I mean, obviously you don't want to discount that. But if you're just looking at it from a standpoint of an Excel spreadsheet and like what's best for you economically on paper, yeah, it'd probably benefit Canadians to be the 51st state. But there, from a libertarian standpoint, which is what I wanted to focus on, that jives, right? Because we're not taking something by force. This is not against the aggression principle. We're taking it by persuasion, and just like a free market, to where the transaction hopefully benefits both parties involved. So assuming there's some sort of strategic value there, I would love to have Greenland. I would love to have control over the Panama Canal, and I guess possibly Canada. It's definitely be an improvement over Trudeau, that's for sure. But I would hope that there was a way that we could do that without just taking it by force, putting a gun to someone's head and saying, "Give it to me, or else I'm going to pull the trigger because I'm a bigger bully than you are." Okay, now what I want to talk about is the dollar. I mean, this is really what I think most people should be considering the most in terms of global macro and setting up their portfolio. A lot of the feedback I get when I talk about the dollar relative to other fiat currencies is, "Oh, George, who cares? I'm just going to buy gold." Or, "Oh, George, who cares? That's just the dollar against the yen. I'm just going to buy NASDAQ, or I'm just going to buy Facebook," or something like that. Well, okay, what you really aren't thinking about is the fact that the dollar versus the yen impacts the price of gold. It could potentially impact the price of all assets. It sure as hell did during the GFC. Like, what was the GFC all about? Was that all about just mortgages? Of course not. That was a result of a shortage of liquidity, dollar liquidity. Okay, what do you get if the dollar goes to 200 against the yen? You get some proper lack of dollar liquidity. You get a scramble for dollars, right? You get a shortage of dollars. And therefore, what you get is a liquidity event where the Japanese are selling everything on their balance sheet to get the dollars they have to have. And everything includes gold. Everything includes Facebook, Google, US assets. And by the way, everything includes CLOs, collateralized loan obligations, which the Japanese banks have bought hand over fist because they needed some sort of yield above and beyond their dollar funding costs. I've done many videos on this. But that, a lot of people look at corporate spreads and they're like, "Oh, well, we don't have anything to worry about because corporate spreads are very low." Well, maybe, but maybe that's just a result of these Eurodollar banks not having a choice but to buy things that are way out the risk curve. And therefore, that artificial buying, if you will, leads to the market thinking there's a lot less risk than there really is. Just throwing that out there, just making people understand that balance sheets of Japanese entities have a lot of US assets, right? As do balance sheets of Malaysian entities, of Brazilian entities, of Indian entities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if the dollar is ripping against those other fiat currencies, that can have a massive impact on the price of gold, just like we saw during 2008. Okay, now, to be clear, that's the buying opportunity, but it impacts it. So I did a couple tweets the other day about how money actually works. And you have to understand how money works, or the monetary system, because the monetary system is dollar-based, right? That's the reserve currency. So in order to predict the probabilities of the dollar versus yen or dollar versus any fiat currency, you got to understand how the dollar works to begin with, or else it's just the blind leading the blind. So let's go over to this chart or actually, let's go over to tweets first, and then we're going to go over a diagram, almost like a whiteboard video. I want to walk you guys through to help you really get your head around this, because this is going to give you a massive, massive advantage over other retail investors, because so few Americans, average Joe and Janes, and so few experts actually understand how this stuff really works. It would blow your mind how many hedge fund managers I've had to explain this to. So we're going to go over it right now. You guys are going to understand it in the next 10 minutes. And from that standpoint, you are going to be a hell of a lot smarter than I would say probably 75% of the hedge fund managers out there. So let's dive into it. We're going to look at Twitter right here. I say sorry to single someone out, but the account is anonymous. This is by far the most common misunderstanding about money currency that I see anywhere since doing this. Since starting my YouTube channel in 2019 or whatever, this is by far the biggest misunderstanding mistake that people make in terms of anything in macro, not just money. So banks don't lend existing money. So let's start with what the guy was saying here, the anonymous guy. Here's where things get interesting. When you pay off your mortgage, the demand for dollars to service the debt does indeed end. But let's not confuse demand with supply. The dollars you use to pay off your mortgage don't vanish. They simply change hands from your bank account to the lenders. This doesn't inherently decrease the supply of dollars in circulation. Instead, it's more like a redistribution of those dollars. The bank might lend those dollars out again, keeping the supply fairly consistent. So while your personal demand for those dollars ends, the broader supply of dollars in the economy doesn't shrink just because one mortgage is paid off. So you see, the idea here is, let's go back to, here we go. It's back to my response tweet here. The idea, and this is, look, I'm not blaming this guy, because it's an understandable mistake. Like, how many Americans out there think that banks just take money from one guy and lend it to the other guy? Again, probably 99.99999%. But that's completely and totally wrong. And that makes all the difference in the world in terms of predicting what's going to happen to the dollar versus yen. In other words, what's going to happen to the price of gold or assets, liquidity, right? So what we have to understand is the bank is not taking, let's see if I've got no, I don't have any. Oh, actually I've got, here we go. This will give you guys a great visual here. Just bear with me. Okay, so right here, I have a $20 bill. So what this guy is thinking is he is thinking that the bank takes this $20 bill and lends it to someone. And then when that person pays back the loan, they're giving it back to the bank. And then the bank is putting it in its coffers. And then the bank has that $20 to therefore lend to someone else. So just because someone pays off their loan, it doesn't mean this $20 disappears. It's right here in my hand. It just goes from this guy's back pocket to the bank vault. And it doesn't impact the supply, even though that guy's demand for dollars to pay his mortgage or whatever it was, to pay his loan, has now gone to zero. Yes, demand has gone down, but the supply of dollars is still there, George. Why? This isn't even debatable. This isn't even controversial. Everyone knows this is how it works. See, that's the problem, right? Because the way this really works is there was no dollars, or there were no dollars to begin with. None. Right? At least the $20 that was lent to the borrower, that did not exist before. because what they lent really isn't dollars. It's actually an IOU for $1 that was created out of thin air by the bank. We call that a commercial bank deposit liability. It's just an electronic IOU for dollars, which ironically enough are an IOU for gold, or now an IOU for nothing. So there's a difference between $1 and an IOU for $1. See, what the bank is creating when they're lending to a borrower is they're creating IOUs for dollars that person is then taking and giving to someone else as purchasing power, because that someone else is happy to take the IOUs denominated in dollars from Bank of America. Why not? It gets to the point where the IOUs circulate, and even though they represent claims on dollars, they circulate and they are used for settlement just as real dollars would be. And if you want proof of this, next time you go down to Chipotle, just use your debit card. Are they going to say, absolutely not, sir? We are not taking that debit card because those are IOUs for dollars. We don't want to get rug pulled here. No. We are only going to accept real dollars. We are only going to accept cash. That's it. Or bank reserves. Probably don't have bank reserves. So we're only going to accept cash. We are not going to accept those IOUs for dollars from some sort of bank. See? So, and of course, I'm being sarcastic there, that any Chipotle, any business in the United States, for that matter, almost any business, is going to gladly accept IOUs from a bank for dollars. They don't necessarily have to have the dollars, right? Okay, so now let's go over to why. We go over to a diagram here. And this is, let's try to zoom in here. Josh, can you see that? Is that pretty clear?
Yeah.
Okay, so what you guys, let's just give you a visual here. And unfortunately, if I zoom or if I make the pointer go up, it's going to bring it down so you guys can't see. But in the upper left, we start with the bank. Balance sheet, assets on the left, liabilities on the right. You see there's nothing there. Okay? So this is really just kind of a visual representation of the mechanics behind what happens so you can understand why that guy is wrong and where he is derailing. So the bank has no assets, no liabilities in this example. We got average Joe. He says, hey, I want a loan. And the bank says, fine, we'll go ahead and give you a loan for the $100 you want. So the bank, so the next step here is right on this line. The bank now has a deposit liability for $100. Now, that's not $100 in cash. That's not 5 of these. Those are $100 of IOUs for dollars. They just created those IOUs out of thin air. Just like if, just like if I borrowed something from you and I gave you a piece of paper that's an IOU, I just created that IOU out of thin air. Right? That's just like a note from me to you, and I've got my signature on it. Same thing here. The bank is just saying, okay, we owe you 100 of these green pieces of paper, $100 bills, let's say. So then the average Joe says, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and take that deposit, those $100 of IOUs, and I'm going to give them to Chipotle. And Chipotle accepts them, just like dollars, although they're not dollars. They're IOUs for dollars from that bank. So how the balance sheet changes here is the bank now has the $100 worth of liabilities, the IOUs, to Joe. And Joe has those IOUs as an asset on his balance sheet. The offsetting asset for the bank is the loan for $100 that was just created. So the bank is creating $100 worth of IOUs. And then Joe is saying, I will return the $100 in IOUs back to you, Mr. Banker. And we're excluding interest just to keep the example simple. And that would be the asset, again, that offsets the liability that was created to begin with. And then, of course, that loan is going to be a liability on average Joe's balance sheet. Okay, this is pretty straightforward. We all get this. Where the guy on Twitter completely derailed is the next step. So if whoa, okay. So if the average Joe pays back that $100 loan the very next day, what happens to the balance sheets? They go right back to where they were at the beginning. This increased the money supply, even though they're IOUs. This increased the money supply by $100, and paying it back decreased the money supply, or the supply of IOUs, which effectively operate in the real economy as the underlying asset, dollars, cash dollars, if you want to look at it that way. So now let's look at, let's see, this probably gonna have a little harder time here. So I'm gonna have to, I'm gonna have to zoom out so you guys can see this. But we start off, and this is how this guy is seeing it in his mind. In his mind, it starts off with the bank having the $100 asset, and then them lending this to Joe. So now they have that $100 liability, which, if you think about it, that in and of itself is weird. And then Joe has this deposit as an asset. Let's just say that he didn't borrow the money, that he just happened to have it. And therefore, it's on the bank's balance sheet. They've got an offsetting asset, whatever that asset may be. Okay. So then what happens is, if the average Joe, let's say, gives that $100 to the bank for, let's say, payment for some sort of bill or something, then the way this guy on Twitter sees it, as the bank would then have $200 worth of assets, because they had $100 of assets to begin with, and Joe just gave them a payment for another $100. So they decreased his account balance by 100, and they increased their account balance by 100. See, that's what the guy on Twitter is thinking, when in reality, that's not what happens. What happens is the payment is the reduction of the liability side of their balance sheet. That's payment. Because what does that do? Well, by them taking Joe's account balance from $100 down to zero, they now have $0 in liabilities, but they still have the $100 asset. Therefore, their equity position has gone up by $100. You see, so the payment was actually made by decreasing the liability side of their balance sheet, which increased their overall equity position. Where most people think that if a payment is made to a bank, the settlement is done by not only reducing the liability side of their balance sheet, but by somehow also increasing the asset side. And again, that's not what happens. Let me actually, well, I don't have a clean piece of paper here. No, I'm not going to do that. It's going to get, I just can't draw this and put it up here. It gets all fuzzy and everything. So that's really the bottom line here, guys, is you have to, I mean, there's several different ways I can say it so you can get your head around it, if this isn't something that comes just easy for you. But the main takeaway here is that banks aren't lending existing money to their borrowers. They're creating IOUs out of nothing. And therefore, when that loan is paid off, those IOUs simply disappear. And therefore, that increases their equity position by the amount of the payment. It doesn't increase the asset side of their balance sheet. It just decreases the liabilities, again, which increases their equity, which is the benefit to the bank. Josh, what do you see as the biggest confusion around the creation of money or the destruction of money in terms of lending? I mean, you talk to a lot of guys in the space. What do you think is the biggest point of confusion there?
Usually, I think people just say that the banks are taking your money and giving it to other people. So it's not that banks are creating money, they're just lending out 10 to 1 your dollars. That's what I hear constantly.
Yeah, which goes back to pretty much what we're saying there. And that it's the view, and let's get back to Twitter here. It's the view this guy has that if you are giving the bank your dollars, then they are somehow increasing their assets. When in reality, you giving them your dollars just means them decreasing their liabilities, not increasing their assets. And what are their liabilities at the end of the day? Their liabilities are M2 money supply. M2 money supply. So if there are more loans being paid off than are being created, the money supply is decreasing. And if there are more loans being created than being paid off, the money supply is increasing. See, this is what we have to think of. So, George, why does this matter in terms of the dollar versus the yen? Because we have to look at a pie chart of the overall percentage of currency units that have been lent into existence and therefore have the ability to be extinguished, right? Because if you have the majority of your currency units in a society, these green pieces of paper, then you cannot get rid of them. The supply can't go down unless you just burn it or something like that. But no matter how much you lend and how much you pay off, the amount of currency units is going to be the exact same. If 100% of the currency units in an economy were printed, right? But if 100% of the currency units were not printed, but are just simply IOUs of the bank, or maybe a better way to say it is it's just credit. It's just credit. If 100% of the IOUs in an economy are just simply credit, then once that credit is paid back, there's no more IOUs, are there? And if the IOU was the only form of money or currency, then the amount of currency now is zero. That's the big difference, guys. So when you're looking at the dollar, because the dollar is the global reserve currency, we have the Eurodollar system. That means that there's a much higher percentage of dollars that are just simply IOUs, that are just simply credit. That's it. Right? So let's just say 99%, especially outside the United States, right? When we got this Eurodollar system that's reserveless and cashless. In other words, basically dollarless. But yet there's $75 trillion out there. It's not 75 trillion of these, it's 75 trillion of credit, of bank IOUs that are being traded as the exact same thing. You see, so then what happens is outside the United States, if the demand for dollars goes down, what happens to the supply? It goes down as well. Because there are more loans being paid off than are being generated. See, so this is what always gives the dollar kind of a bid, if you will, is that the demand for dollars can only go down to a point that is equal to the outstanding debt. And if the demand goes down below that, that's only a result of the loans being paid off. And if the loans are being paid off, the amount of dollars is decreasing. That's why it's so difficult for the dollar to go down or quote unquote crash. Now, the dollar can go down for a lot of different reasons short term. But the crash, it's very, very difficult versus other fiat currencies. And then not only do you add that dynamic, but then you also have to layer on top of that, because of the mechanical structure of the monetary system, the dollar is a flight to safety. The dollar is a safe haven currency, whether we like it or not. We got to accept it. It is what it is. Because of the monetary system, the way it's structured, the dollar is seen as a safe haven asset. And another thing is because a lot of your input costs, like Japan, denominated in dollars. And then again, so much of that dollar denominated debt exists outside of the United States. So you have an environment right now where we're risk off, therefore more people going into the dollar. And on top of that, because we're risk off, the banks are lending less. Well, if the banks are lending less, what's happening to the amount of currency units out there? What's happening to the amount of bank IOUs, credit denominated in dollars? It's shrinking outside the United States. As hard as that is for Americans to understand, it's shrinking while at the same time the demand for dollars is going up. So in that environment, what happens to the DXY? It goes up, right? So this is, but it starts, the process, the understanding process starts with realizing that banks don't lend other people's money. They create money. They create these IOUs. Therefore, if the debt is being paid off, the supply of currency is decreasing. You understand that, guys. And like I said, you are going to be smarter and understand more about the global monetary system than 75%. I would even say 90% of hedge fund managers right now that are managing billions of dollars, as scary as that is. And on that bombshell, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I hope you had a very Merry Christmas. I hope you have a happy New Year. And make sure going into 2025, we are standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism. And we'll see you on the next video.